Vivica Williams, and you're watching Head to Head. There seems to be a connection between corruption and inequality. When people grow cynical with the status quo, they often turn to leaders who promise to break the cycle of corruption and privilege, to quote Transparency International. And this is how corruption and inequality feed populism. So today we're talking with Mikhailo Vinitsky, an associate professor of Lviv Business School and a political commentator, about the political atmosphere in Ukraine. Mikhailo, it's very nice to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me, Vivica.
So let's start with, you recently wrote an article about the revolutionary cycle in Ukraine. So tell me what this means, the revolutionary cycle.
Okay, well, first of all, most of us, when we talk about revolutions, and specifically about Ukraine, we talk about something that happened supposedly 3 years ago. Well, revolutions aren't actually like that. Revolutions are processes. They're not events, they're processes. So in political science and in sociology and social sciences, what we talk about is we look at the classic way of looking at things is we look at the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, etc., and we see certain patterns. And usually they boil down to sort of 5 steps of revolution. You've got the old regime, you've got a violent overthrow, you've got a period of sort of moderate reform, and then after that very often comes terror, in other words, where they sort of chop people's heads off. And then we've got something called thermidor, which is kind of a cooling off period that happens. And generally, the Ukrainian case has been considered to be really similar to the American case, or at least most people have been hoping that it's similar to the American case, because in the American case there wasn't a terror. Well, it looks to me now that we might be reading things a little wrong. We're in that third phase. We're in the reform phase.
The moderate reform.
Yeah, moderate reform phase. And now the logical thing is that the next phase after that is the guillotine, if you like. Sort of that's the French analogy, I guess. It didn't happen in the U.S. case, and this was one of the things that people were hoping for in the Ukrainian case. And I think there was a misreading, because we thought of the revolution of the Maidan as being sort of in national terms. Right. And so a lot of people were looking for a sort of a nationalist leader to come in and perhaps do some sort of terrorizing. Well, that certainly didn't happen.
Thank God.
But there's a lot of pent up protest potential at the moment that we're seeing. And a lot of people are very frustrated with the fact that it's been 3 years, and, Yanukovych's regime is gone, but the vestiges of corruption and the practices are still there. Right. And really, at the end of the day, nobody's really been put in prison yet. And that's something that's problematic. This is a big thing.
This is something we discuss a lot. It's like, who's sitting in prison for things that happened this time? It's been 3 years.
Right.
So there's a lot of frustration with this lack of progress, with and I think it's said that corruption is indeed less, but on the other hand, it seems more. Or
corruption is massively less. I mean, look, at the end of the day, one of the things that we had during the Yanukovych regime, people forget about this. I mean, we don't have mezhihirias being built today. We don't have prosecutor generals that are walking around thinking that they're Caesar, and painting paintings of themselves as Caesar, which we used to have with Pshonka. And this was just, I mean, those are just two examples. I mean, we've got all kinds of examples of people around the Yanukovych regime that left the country immediately after Maidan and basically had to leave with literally millions of dollars in cash and in gold and all kinds of other things. So we don't have that kind of accumulation of corrupt practices anymore. We don't have necessarily, we've gotten rid of some of the low-level corruption as well. So police officers aren't as corrupt as they used to be. And certainly when you get stopped on the streets, you don't necessarily reach for your wallet. So these types of things have changed. But I think the demands of people, after seeing so many deaths on the Maidan and so many deaths on the front, is that, we should have cleaned up corruption completely by now. And the reality is that we're not cleaning it up, and people are really... There's a lot of people that are very angry, and I would say that there is a certain level of people are out for blood. People want to see punishment.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's usually the case. We see this even in, I think, Colombia, these other places where they want someone to pay. You need someone to pay for these things.
That's right. And that's and at this point, the problem is that the longer it goes beyond Maidan, the people that will end up paying will not be from the old regime. They will be from the reformers who were not able to put into jail the old regime, and are not able to punish them. Now, it's quite obvious that the old regime is not going to get punished at this point, because they're all sitting in Russia or in other countries. They're not coming back. There's no danger of that. And now the sort of the popular anger is going out against the current government and the current law enforcement officials that are really being quite inept. And the problem actually is not law enforcement and not government. The major problem is the judiciary. And this is really where...
And we look at the Anti-Corruption Bureau. I mean, I think this is a very big case here when we have Nasirov, we have the new former parliament, and I do have that fear of if these people aren't prosecuted, aren't sitting in jail, this can also be this huge watershed moment.
And that's, I mean, look, at the end of the day, what you need to do is look at things. You can look at formal statistics of who believes in who, what kind of trust levels we have. And unfortunately, the trust levels at the moment in the judiciary, in the parliament, and the president are at all-time lows. Okay? So we're looking at less than 15% of the population that trust major institutions of government. So you've got 80% that have mistrust for major institutions. Those are the large-scale statistics. But then you go out and talk to the sort of the taxi drivers and the barbers and the people on the streets, and you find, well, you know, what's the major issue? The major issue is that, you know, 3 years ago the hryvnia was worth 8 hryvnia to the dollar.
Right.
Now it's worth 26. Where's the money gone? Where, you know, who's taking all this stuff? And the reality is that people don't necessarily have a deep knowledge of economics, and they don't understand that some of the things that were done over the last 3 years were in order to get rid of the problems that had accumulated over the previous period.
Well, and also we see what I often say to people we have this conversation is, well, you had that period during Yanukovych and beyond where you didn't see these problems. They made it seem nice.
That's right.
You had the 8-to-1. Yeah. You kept gas prices low. These were the things. There's problems were underneath, but they made it seem like there weren't.
Right, and this is one of the things I talked about today. I sort of made this analogy. You know, when you have cancer, cancer is the thing that's killing you. It's not the chemotherapy. Now, the chemotherapy can be blamed. What has happened over the last 3 years is we've had chemotherapy, but the cancer existed well before the chemotherapy. But people are blaming the therapy rather than the cancer.
Right.
Now, what's the way out of that? Now, the problem is the way out of that is to get some of this pent-up social energy into not a protest, not somebody being angry, not people getting out on the streets, not people venting their protests in violence necessarily, or because there is a risk of violence, so that we understand. It's to get into another election cycle. Because, and this is something that I've been trying to get people to understand, that an election cycle is a way of getting pent-up social energy into some sort of a constructive, if you like, area. Now, the problem is that that's not a very popular alternative.
Well, and you talk about, so we come with the revolutionary cycle, and this is one of the things you're talking about with managing the revolutionary cycle.
Well, this is exactly where we go into the American example, as opposed to going through the French or the Russian example.
Right.
The American example is you throw social energy into an election, because that's where people start getting their energy out, and they can actually feel like they're making a difference, because they are going to change the elites. One of the things that happens is that with every single election cycle, we get new people in parliament, we get new people in government. This is one of the things that people are calling for. People want to see new faces. The reality is we've had quite a bit of rotation, but people want to see even more. Now, the problem with that is rotation of elites means that the old elites are going to go away.
Right.
Guess what? The people that are in power today are not interested in an election.
And this is a big problem. And it doesn't even matter if it's here in Ukraine. It's anywhere where you have sitting people who they don't, of course, want to be out of power.
Well, exactly, and this is, I mean, we've got the example of the United States recently. We've had the French elections just recently, where we've have two candidates who are both representatives of non-elite groups. In other words, they have no representatives in Parliament at the moment. You've got the whole Brexit thing. In other words, this is something that's sort of a worldwide process where people are calling for a change of elites, change of government, change of faces, if you like. And the fact that it's happening through elections there is probably a good thing.
Well, however, I would stop you there, though, because this is this concern that I have and a lot of people have, where if having an election period in times where, you know, we talked at the beginning, this corruption and inequality together pushing for this populism that can make things worse.
Right, it could make things worse, and you're absolutely right. There's always a danger of that. Now, the question at this point is that's the argument, by the way, of Poroshenko and the people that are in power at the moment, that if we call an election today, or if we call early elections for the fall, what will simply happen is that the opposition bloc will gain more seats, and Tymoshenko and Leshko will probably gain seats, and these are just populists that are in actual fact not going to be good for the country. They may have a point, but the reality is that from the perspective of long term, and not even long term, but medium term, there is pent up social energy in this country that needs to be let out. Now, it's going to be let out either on the street or it's going to be let out through an election process. There's really very few other alternatives, and that's really where the danger is. So from the perspective of, short-termism, and I would say one of the things we need in this country is we need elections every 2 years. Now, because we need to see a change of faces, and we need to have energy going into some sort of a constructive area whereby people will see their voices actually heard.
When also having elections more often, that would hopefully put this pressure on the lawmaker to actually make some changes so that they can keep their position, get reelected.
The contrary argument to that is, well, then they're going to be making short-term decisions, and right now one of the things we need in Ukraine is we need to make painful decisions, painful reforms that are not particularly going to be popular. Well, but reality is that in some cases we've been able to actually find solutions for doing the right kinds of reforms that are actually quite popular if they're communicated properly. So we see in the healthcare sector, for example, we see a lot of good things happening in the healthcare sector. Yeah, there's a lot of discontent with what was going on in financial sector, for example, with previous former Foreign Minister Yuresko. But now people are starting to understand that, wait a second, that was something that needed to be done. And she was there for a year. And now if we go into an election cycle, she actually has a very good chance of being very popular. So I think that people are in Ukraine are smart enough to understand that sometimes difficult decisions need to be made. Not everybody's smart enough to understand that. Certainly there will be a populist kind of...
Well, and emotions, I mean, this is what populists pull on, is this fear, from the population.
Sure.
Right, so this is the thing that
and this is something, this is, again, I'm not sure that there's any real easy ways out, but one of the things that we're going to see if we don't have elections in the fall, and this is something that I'm very concerned about, is not necessarily another Maidan, because Ukrainians are not going to be protesting en masse for 3 months anymore. The issue is that, and it's not going to be a peaceful protest anymore. That's the problem. That there's just too much armament in the population. There's too much anger with what's going on in the east. There's too many people that have actual experience of wartime activities, and in other words, they understand what it is to shoot others. And I'm not trying to be alarmist. It's the reality that this country has a lot of anger pent up in it. And that anger's got to go someplace. If it doesn't go someplace through legitimate institutional kinds of mechanisms, it may blow up in other ways. And history shows us that those other ways are not particularly good for the largest proportion of the population. That's what's scary. I'm really afraid of seeing a sort of a descent into terror. And that is, in other words, lynch mobbing and going after, right after the Maidan, one of the things we had this lustration by throwing people into garbage containers.
Yeah, I remember this.
Yeah, rubbish containers. And that was kind of a joke. But it could get worse, much worse, because there's a lot of energy that's pent up anti-elite, anti-establishment. Anybody that has any kind of money is considered to be suspect if they've had any kind of government job previously. That's really kind of scary.
Well, let's take a moment and have a look at some of these protests. So let's have a look at some of the protesters and some of the voices that we see, this populist slant.
The leftovers of Yanukovych's gang sitting in this room to this day are in conspiracy with the authorities in power, which is what allows them to keep their seats.
having a look at that gives us kind of a bigger view of what's going on in the country to kind of see what you were talking about. So let's coming back to what you were saying about the fall and about autumn. And why are you feeling that this is this time period?
I get a lot of questions about that. Why the autumn? Well, I guess the answer, the banal answer, if you like, is that Ukrainians are too busy in the springtime to actually revolt. It's pretty. People are looking forward to summer vacations. Right. Some people are planting. There's all kind. I mean, right now is not the time to protest. If we look at the major protests that have ever happened in Ukrainian history, it's always happened October, November. October, November is really a time when things start, people start getting into this sort of angry mode and thinking about what's going on in the wintertime, etc. I'm actually very pessimistic on a worldwide scale of what's going to happen in the autumn as well. We need to remember that stock market crashes in the U.S. always happen in October, November as well. So, I mean, these are all things that sort of come together. The autumn will be hot, I believe.
And so what, I'm not asking you to solve all the problems, but what are you saying the next steps are for Ukraine that could help alleviate this? So I know you're saying with elections, either calling earlier elections or really trying to popularize or move things forward. So what exactly, what ideas do you have?
I think that one of the things that, the average Ukrainian has stopped talking about politics and has been, in other words, stopped talking about politics on any kind of a basis of, the average Ukrainian has stopped talking about politics in a way that is with any depth. Okay, so what they're talking about is, I don't like that person, or I like that person. In other words, that's the level of discourse.
So, in for TV shows, what the TV show topics? This gives us a good idea of.
Well, one of the things we see right now is that the political talk shows have their ratings going like just so low. People are not interested.
Because it used to be very popular,
high, absolutely.
You'd have the presidential candidates, you've had large, major people here, and now.
Well, one of the issues is that the government is not doing enough in terms of its communication strategy, but that's been true for the last 3 years. It's just now we're seeing finally the effect of that. We used to have a prime minister, not that it was particularly popular, nor did I particularly like him, but nevertheless, once a week, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk would get in front of the TV cameras and talk to people, sort of do these fireside chats. Right. The current prime minister doesn't do that. The president does not do that.
Well, and this is a big problem I've seen, and Ukrainians have seen, where they push through a reform, make major changes, and then only then do they talk to people about it, and this doesn't work for drawing.
In fact, they're not actually talking to people about it, they're talking at people rather than talking to people. So there's very little explanation of why we need to do this or that reform. And that's really problematic. And I think that, in a short-term way, most politicians will tell you, well, people aren't interested anyways. Well, that may be true. People are not interested, and if you don't talk to them at all, if you don't talk to the electorate at all, what you're going to start seeing is rumors and conspiracy theories and all kinds of things like that. We've had this thing with the parliamentarian Martynenko, just this week, who was arrested and now has been freed on his own recognizance, I guess.
So he was just to bring our viewers up to speed. He was arrested, accused of embezzling several millions of dollars. And he's the largest politician, highest level politician after Nasirov, who's been arrested.
He's the highest level legislator that's been arrested. Now, the story there is that he was the head of the Energy Committee in Parliament. So he had specific and direct contact with some of the atomic energy generation plants. And basically what he did was he arranged for Ukraine to get some of its uranium, instead of buying it from Russia, buying it from Kazakhstan, which I guess is a positive thing. But the reality is that he wasn't buying it directly from Kazakhstan. It was buying it through an offshore company in Cyprus or wherever it was, that he happened to own. So he was making a little bit of money on the side. When I say a little bit of money, it's to the tune of about $30 to $40 million.
Right. So now you're bringing him, and what's your discussion with him? What's an indicator of?
The issue is that what happened was that whether or not he's guilty is actually besides the point. The reality is that that his case is front and center on the TV screens, and you have up to 20 people from his faction of parliament in other words, 20 parliamentarians, including 3 ministers, come to his defense. And what that has in fact done in many of the population, it has questioned the general legitimacy of everything that's going on. In other words, I can't tell if Martynenko is actually guilty or not, but what I can tell is that this guy that's been accused is now being defended by 20 parliamentarians that I'm supposed to trust. Oh, and by the way, he's being accused by another institution that I'm supposed to trust, and he's in front of a judicial inquiry that I don't really understand anyway, so I'm not going to trust the whole thing.
So this is not just to Ukraine, this is an issue we're having worldwide. So what then, with this not being able to trust, these people being supported who have been accused of these embezzlement, these large crimes, so what would you say then is a takeaway that we could take away from this, and what some next steps should be here? The
next step is always, whenever we have people unhappy, society, I mean, I'd say this as a social scientist that studies this stuff on a regular basis. When people are unhappy, they have 2 ways of going about their unhappiness. They can either blow up in protest, and then things become unpredictable, or you can channel that energy through some sort of institutional means. And unfortunately, the only institutional means that we have as humanity thought up so far is an election. All right. And however painful that may be, election is a better alternative than to having the street blow up.
All right. So, well, Mikhailo, thank you for coming in. I would hope we're going to have you back on, and I hope that we can be talking about that second option,
yes,
and not that first. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today. This is Vivica Williams, and you've been watching Head to Head. Today we had on Mikhailo Vinnytsky. Thank you, and have a great day.